Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed for part 2 of our November Q&A series. Part 1's up on the channel, but please don't click away because that's bad for YouTube. So instead watch this video, then go back and watch part 1. But anyway, let's get into it. But before we do...
Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their CryoSheet graphene thermal pads, which are an excellent alternative to thermal pastes. They offer very high thermal conductivity with no liquid components, so they can't dry out and therefore don't degrade over time like pastes and even liquid metals. CryoSheet is very easy to use, it's extremely durable, and is available in a range of sizes to suit most applications. I've personally done some high-end GPU testing with CryoSheet, and the results were impressive, very similar in fact to that of liquid metal, but without the mess, and of course, no risk of drying out. So for more information, please check the link in the video description.
Do you think the reason Arrow Lake launch seems like a disaster is because the team working on Arrow Lake were pulled back to fix Raptor Lake, leading them to deliver subpar quality?
You could probably blame some of the launch hiccups on that. It's an excuse, let's say, but there was always going to be teething issues, early adopter issues when launching a new platform with an entirely new CPU architecture. Those things pretty much unavoidable. AMD, Intel, there's always problems there when doing that. So that's just par for the course, really. As for the performance side of things, like forget compatibility and stability and all that sort of stuff, just the actual outright performance, and even ignoring performance hiccups like potential scheduling issues and stuff like that. Just let's say we're a few months down the track and it's all been sorted out now, latest BIOS, Windows updates, the whole lot, and it's performing pretty much as it should perform. I think even there it's still going to be pretty underwhelming, pretty disappointing compared to what Intel had previously, and then especially compared to what AMD has now, just because it's such a huge change in direction. Like Intel were basically pushing in one direction, which was frequency, power consumption, the whole lot. They blew both of those things out of the water, which resulted in great gaming performance with very poor efficiency. And as we said leading up to this, they can really fix one of those things quite substantially, but they can't fix both of those things. So step one was to go after the absolutely ludicrous power efficiency, which they have achieved with Arrow Lake. The power efficiency is much, much better. The performance just isn't quite there. So hopefully with future generations, more refinements of this tile-based architecture, they'll achieve that as well. Which is why a lot of people say it's sort of like their Zen 1 moment, which you can debate whether or not that's the case, but there's some likeness to that situation where they've had to completely... It's a radical change from CPU architectures of old from Intel, and it's something that will, hopefully, though, they should be able to build off and move forward. But there's just that initial pain of like a reduction in frequency and an improved power consumption, which again, just when compared to what they had, it seems like a step backwards in terms of raw performance, because in some ways it just is. Increased latency, lower frequency, stuff like that is always going to hurt gaming performance.
Yeah, I think if they pulled the Raptor Lake fix team away and put that onto Arrow Lake entirely, it might have improved some of those teething issues, as you say.
It's conceivable that some of the things wouldn't have been a problem.
Maybe, but the fundamental design aspects were set in stone probably years ago, in which case, the Raptor Lake team was not fixing Raptor Lake at that point. They had probably moved on to something else. So Arrow Lake, the fundamental design, which I think, as you said, the product in its best capabilities was probably not going to be as competitive as AMD's parts. That was not going to be solved by pulling the Raptor Lake team to work on Arrow Lake. That was set in stone ages ago. And obviously not ideal that they had to split their resources a little bit. Bit of a disaster for them in that sense. But yeah, it kind of is what it is at the end of the day. And I think you said in a lot of your reviews, you tried to look past the teething issues to see what is the part actually going to be capable of. And that conclusion was still, it's not amazing.
Yep.
So
the only thing that could save it was a radical reduction in price, which Intel can't or aren't willing to do.
Yep.
So
how much ray tracing impacts CPU performance? Could it make buying a high-end CPU like a 9800 XUD viable option when aiming at high refresh rate ray trace gaming, especially when using upscaling to mitigate the GPU bottleneck?
So I kind of snickered at high refresh rate ray trace gaming.
That's probably possible in a couple of
I was
titles.
gonna say,
It depends what GPU you've got, obviously.
There'd be a few select examples of that. Look, ray tracing certainly does or can increase CPU load, but generally it's difficult to benchmark because you do end up GPU limited, even when using upscaling. So, yeah, it's. I guess it's one of those situations where if you're looking for high refresh rate, high-end gaming performance, like that's your focus, whether you're doing that with or without ray tracing, you probably want to have quite a powerful CPU. And depending on what you have now, so let's say you're looking at executing quite a large CPU upgrade, it's been a while since you've done it, then a 9800X3D probably makes sense. If you already have a 7800X3D or even a 7700X or a 13th or 14th gen Intel processor, then probably doesn't make that much sense unless you just want the best of the best. Then sure, I guess do that. But yeah, again, you'd have high-end hardware anyway. You'd have a good monitor, you'd have a high-end GPU presumably because you want to drive high frame rates. So we're sort of talking about a premium high-end experience. So buying a 9800X3D, not a big deal.
Yeah, I think you'd find in a lot of games, like single-player titles, without ray tracing, you're probably going to be CPU limited when trying to run at a high refresh rate anyway.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of games, especially these days, more modern games, that don't run much over like 100 FPS, 120 FPS on flagship level CPUs, in which case, that's the case before ray tracing. So ray tracing is only going to make that a little worse on the CPU. So even then, like without even considering it, you would get a 9800X3D for any sort of high refresh rate single player gaming, because that's just the way games are at the moment. Especially examples like we've seen with Stalker, Starfield, and a couple of other examples. What does Space Marine 2 run at using like ultra settings on a CPU? It's pretty limited in some of those scenarios.
In the big horde battles, pushing much over 100 FPS, very CPU limited. 9800X3D might get to like 120 FPS in some of the bigger battles. Yeah. So again, if you want that high refresh rate experience, definitely wanting to invest in the best CPU you can get your hands on.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that there's probably a couple of titles that you would potentially run into issues with, like high frame rate ray tracing. Games like the Spider-Man titles it depends on the resolution that you're running at, of course. I'm assuming that you're maybe using like 1440p with upscaling, so you're running at like a 1080p or sub 1080p native rendering resolution. Yeah, potentially a game like that, maybe like a Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition. Just those sort of games. You're not going to be running into CPU limits with, say, like a Cyberpunk with ray tracing enabled, Alan Wake 2 with path tracing enabled, Black Myth Wukong. So there's extreme examples of ray tracing visual quality. You're going to be slamming into a GPU limit in pretty much every scenario. I don't think there's any path traced examples that are CPU limited.
Yeah, well, Black Myth Wukong's a great example. Alan Wake 2 is another one. They're just very, very light on CPU requirements there. So almost always going to be GPU limited, no matter what. Yeah.
I mean, to be fair, do we know that Alan Wake 2 runs at like 200 FPS on the CPU? Probably we're so graphically limited to it may still only run at 100 or 120 FPS CPU limited, just that the GPU settings are so extreme generally that's a pipe dream anyway. But yeah, like just for high refresh rate gaming, get a high-end CPU. What upgrade would speed up shader compilations, and why in the past number of years is that and the stutters more of an issue as it affects so many games? Yeah, I mean, we're starting to see some pretty annoying shader compilation implementations. I think it's acceptable to have the first launch of the game, you sort of have a lengthy shader compilation process. That's good if that resolves stuttering issues. But we're starting to see a couple of games now where it has to do some form of shader compilation on every launch, which I think is a bit over the top. Maybe that improves performance, but it certainly is a little annoying. But yeah, hopefully a faster CPU would sort of speed that up. What have you sort of seen?
Yeah, it seems to use the CPU quite heavily, at least portions of it. CPU, GPU as well. But yeah, upgrading your CPU, it depends what CPU you have, really. And again, like, I haven't benchmarked it, I guess, is the point. So I don't really want to give advice on what you should spend money on to improve this, because, a substantial CPU upgrade might save you, 20 seconds on 5 minutes or something like that. Just throwing random
Yeah.
figures out there. So it's not something we've really benchmarked or looked into. And it will vary as well from game to game as to what it's hammering the most and where you'll get the most gains.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think as well you sort of have to factor in, like, if games only run one 5-minute shader compilation pass and you can speed that up by 20 seconds, 30 seconds, like, how much would you actually be willing to pay for that as an upgrade? Like, I think the in-game CPU performance is probably much more important than how long a shader compilation takes. Now, if we start to see more games where you have to wait a minute to play the game every time because it's running a minute-long shader compilation every single time, then that will get annoying and is probably something that we would start benchmarking, because it would be that frustrating every time you load the game on a slow CPU to have to wait a minute to even start playing it. But even with some of the more annoying titles like Stalker 2, which even sometimes you change the settings and it's like, restart, oh, yay, shader compilation again.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, it doesn't take that long. I think Dragon Age: The Veilguard's another one that does a little bit of shader compilation every time you launch it. Yeah, it kind of just is the way it is. I think game developers have struggled to mitigate those stuttering issues, the loading between sections and those sort of things, the loading of shaders. So they've implemented this as the solution. So this is what we're getting for the moment, is sort of the shader compilation passes. I think it's kind of been exacerbated by some less than ideal game engines. Unreal Engine 5 probably is the leading candidate for this. And I think that the way you've described it in the past is sort of, these engines are targeting like locked 60 FPS gaming on consoles, where you're not really running into a lot of these sort of CPU or shader issues, because when you lock your frame rate, there's a lot more resources that can be used for these sorts of things. But on PC, with unlocked frame rates, variable frame rates, you get into these situations where everything's being utilized, and so it's trying to do this shader thing in the background while it's trying to render a frame. Oh, you get a stutter at that exact moment. And those game engines just unfortunately haven't been designed to optimize for it, because they're thinking, oh, well, we'll try and make it work at 60 FPS for a console, and then PC gamers can get what they're given. So that's just PC gaming at the moment, isn't it? Like, I'd love to sit here and hopefully a future Unreal Engine version will fix up some of those things, but the examples that we're getting at the moment still have that stutter struggle. So, yeah. Right, I think this is quite a relevant question. What price to performance would Intel Battlemage have to be for you to give it a full-throated endorsement over its GeForce/Radeon competition? And I say it's relevant because we're starting to see leaks of new Intel Battlemage products. There's a little bit of question marks about whether that was cancelled or not, but it seems like the leaks are suggesting it's a real product and coming pretty soon. So, yeah, what are our thoughts? What are your thoughts on what does Battlemage need to do?
Well, so obviously we're comparing it to Radeon and GeForce, and we've been of the opinion that Radeon GPUs for similar rasterization performance need to be at least 10% more affordable than GeForce GPUs at sort of a minimum, but ideally more like 20%. Depends on other things like, does it have the same amount of VRAM, for example, or has it got twice as much VRAM, because that can be factored into it as well. I know that sounds pretty unfair on Radeon, but you do miss out on a few things. It also depends on the performance tier, because stuff like RayTracing is far less important when you're talking about a 4060 Ti class product. So with Battlemage, the assumption is that it's not going to be targeting high-end gaming performance, mid-range to sort of lower-end mid-range. So stuff like RayTracing, probably less of a concern there. If game support and compatibility is comparable to Radeon and GeForce, which it's getting closer, but we've seen that, like, for a lot of these new games, the driver support often isn't there, or it's a little bit delayed. So you don't get great performance off like an Arc A770 straight out of the gate. That can be a problem, something worth considering. But again, it's not a given that the performance is going to be bad. Sometimes it's perfectly acceptable and it's right where you'd expect it to be.
It's improved a lot as well. So they're working on it.
It's improved
a lot. Stagnant sort of thing.
I think just Arc stuff in general has improved a lot. without benchmarking it, like I don't want to give you a figure now and then my opinion in the review be different, because there's plenty of valid reasons for why that could be, because again, we've got to evaluate the product and see how stable it is, compatibility, all that sort of stuff. I don't know, pluck a figure out of the air. Probably 10% cheaper than the sort of best value part in that range, probably a Radeon GPU or something like that. But again, I don't know. There's so many factors to consider here. We really need to do a proper product evaluation to see where everything stands as to whether or not Battlemage is worth investing in.
I think it depends when they launch the products as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they launch it right now, they're kind of going into a market of what will soon be last generation products.
Mm-hmm.
So we could get a product that looks really good in value compared to a 4060, a 7600. But then the next generation products from AMD and NVIDIA are expected basically at the start of January. Not necessarily right down to the lowest end, especially for, I don't think we'll see a 5060 for a couple of months into 2025. Sorry, it's probably going to be more middle of the year. But for most of Battlemage's lifespan, it's probably going to be more competing with next generation parts. So you kind of have to factor that in a little bit. Like, if it's good value for a month, but then is completely destroyed by next gen products in terms of value quite quickly after that, it's not going to be in as good of a position. So that'll be a really interesting one to look out for, because I would think that it would probably need to be better value than like a tier above sort of product. So you're talking about it being better value than like the current Radeon cards. It's probably, if we're expecting, say, 4060 Ti or 7700 XT performance to be more of a mainstream level of performance in the next generation, so that will come, that sort of $400 performance comes down to more like $300, hopefully, fingers crossed. Then that's sort of the performance value sort of tier that Intel would need to go with for these upcoming products. So again, we don't really know when those products are launching, if they do come out first, which I think we're probably expecting them to come out first if we're seeing like box art and those sorts of things already coming out. Leaks from, I think, what was it, ASRock leaked to something.
Yep.
Anyway, if we're sort of seeing that sort of thing, then yeah, we'll see what they try and do. I don't know whether they'll try and go really all out to make it look really impressive now, or try go for the let's get it competing where things are today. But it really depends on the sort of performance they can get out of those parts as well, I guess. Like, where's the top tier level of ARC performance?
Yeah, there's a lot of unknowns right now. It's a difficult question to answer.
Yeah.
All right, Tim, do you think AMD's strategy to focus their 8000 series GPUs to the entry level and mid-range, will that work to gain market share?
Hard one.
Well, it depends on how they do it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess first of all, we should probably qualify by saying that AMD has confirmed this strategy as they're sort of shifting things to the mid-range. I think one of their executives has said that publicly. Secondly, we don't actually know whether that was a choice or whether that was kind of forced upon them. Obviously, they could choose to cancel high-tier products and just focus on mid-range, or they could have made a generation where the highest card is a mid-range card just by accident. So that kind of changes the discussion a little bit. If they're more forced into it, they may not be as aggressive on these sorts of things. If it's a choice, they've willingly gone down that path, then maybe they'll be a bit more aggressive. My gut feel, just based on how we've seen Radeon operate, is that they won't do enough to make this successful. I think that's probably, I don't know whether I even want to say it's like the most likely thing.
Well, historically,
they probably haven't done enough in this area to make it a success. I think if they were able to create a high-end product, that definitely would have been the way to go. Try and target. If they could have the fastest car on the market, they absolutely should have done that. Even if they're still planning on focusing on mid-range products, I think NVIDIA's strategy of always being in that Halo tier, the fastest card, that provides a lot of mind share for people. Even if they're not buying those high-tier cards, they still know NVIDIA has the fastest card, so I'll buy the whatever mid-range stuff because I know it's going to be good. That's usually a strategy that works. So they're really going to have to be serious about this. Like, not just, stuffing around. I was going to use a different word there, but stuffing around and sort of going, targeting the mid-range means NVIDIA minus 10%. Like, that's not targeting the mid-range. NVIDIA doesn't target the mid-range, so targeting a bad product and making it slightly cheaper is still not enough. So, if they're making a product that's really compelling, and we've seen some very compelling low to mid-range AMD products in the past. The RX 480 and RX 580 were great products. The 5700 XT, some people say that's aged poorly, but I think it was a great buy at the time. Excellent sort of mid-range product, and that was a series they didn't have high-end cards. So they can do it. It's just a matter of doing it. That's the real thing, right? It's like, will they actually do it?
I hope so.
Yeah. So, I think there's definitely room for them to do it. Like, I think the opportunity will be handed to them. I think there'll be a gap in the market in that sort of lower to mid-range price tiers for them to take. I think people will be looking for things like more VRAM in lower to mid-range products, which hands AMD a good opportunity because generally they've tried to target more VRAM in these sorts of things. There's talk of FSR4 and sort of AI capabilities with those sorts of things. There's talk of better RayTracing performance for the next generation. So there's all these opportunities right there. It's just a matter of having them all come together into a product that's actually worth buying, that's sold at a really good price. So I don't know. We can't make any predictions about that one because AMD could come out and do anything. Why don't AMD just make all their CPUs have 3D V-cache going forward?
Because companies love product segmentation. So the more products they can make, the better. That's one answer. Also, not everything needs 3D V-cache, so it helps them make more affordable versions of the 8-core or 6-core CPU that they can then sell to businesses or whatever it may be. It just, again, product segmentation is useful, despite the fact that sometimes they like to abuse the hell out of it. I don't think this is an example of that. I think having the non-3D V-cache parts, are useful. They service a real market, so that's all good and well. I think the reason this question's come up is because the 9800X 3D has been quite successful, whereas the 9800X, for example, wasn't. And there are reasons for that. And there are also reasons for why they had to execute the launch in the way that they did. Just sort of unfortunate circumstances there. But yeah, that there's pretty much, I don't know, no other real answer for that one. It's just product segmentation, and the non-3D V-cache parts do make sense for certain applications and use cases.
I think if it was a situation where adding 3D V-cache was extremely cheap, that you'd probably see it across more of the lineup, and there might be products where they just wouldn't bother making the non-3D V-cache model. But we're talking about I won't call it a new process technology,
it's an in-depth packaging process. Like, it's not something they can just,
it's a more costly process at the very least, like creating the extra die, effectively, the cache die, sandwiching that on top, dealing with all that sort of thing, makes the products more expensive. And for just some workloads, you just wouldn't need it. Like my editing rig, for example, has a 7950X in it. I don't do any gaming on it, so there's no point having a 7950X 3D in that system. Would offer absolutely nothing for the things that I use that system for. And so it benefits both me because I can buy a non-3D V-cache model for cheaper, and also benefits AMD because they don't have to make a more expensive part, potentially affecting margins and affecting their competitiveness with, say, Intel that may offer more affordable parts, or parts where they don't have V-cache but are still great for that sort of editing workload. So yeah, it makes sense. And again, like a lot, as you've mentioned, a lot of these CPUs are sold for just business systems, other sort of desktops where they don't need 3D V-cache. So yeah. What annoys you the most about your job? And they've given some examples here. Nonsense online comments, companies doing dumb things, a particular step in the review process. Okay, so what annoys us? Hopefully people don't use this against us.
Yeah, there's not too many things that annoy me, to be honest. There's always, like, when you're doing a review and something pops up, I don't know, like something that's irritating. Like things that annoy me heaps when benchmarking, for example, is like EA games and their 5 hardware change lockout, like that. People ask, why don't you benchmark the Battlefield game or whatever? And that's the reason why, because after 5 hardware changes, we have to wait 24 hours before we can use our our account again, or at least that game on our account. So in the moment, I would easily say this thing annoys me the most about our job, but whether, it's a minor inconvenience in the sense that I just don't test Battlefield. So the workaround is not to test EA games. So that solves that one. If I had to pick something that's probably more core to what we do, it's probably companies being dumb is really annoying. Whenever we have something that's sort of stressful, annoying, or just wasting our time, you can rest assured it's almost always a company doing a dumb thing.
If they try and make our lives difficult, that tends to be pretty annoying, especially the times when we're trying to figure out, let's say we tested a product, the performance has come back, it doesn't look great. And then we're trying to figure out, is that a bug with the product, which is going to be solved via some sort of easy fix or update, or maybe we're just not testing it properly or something, or it's an inherent issue with the product, as in the product is actually bad, that's the performance of the product. And then companies will, usually in that situation, they'll try and, this isn't the case for every company, but some companies will try and delay you, stuff you around. They'll go, we just need to check that internally. Let's try to figure out what's going on. Then you don't hear back for weeks. Send a follow-up. They'll be like, we're still looking into that. And then it just goes nowhere. And that can delay coverage because, ultimately we still want to present the most accurate information. We want to tell you how the product performs, but an unusual result, we want to figure out, is that a bug or is that a performance problem? So that's come up a few times, I think, over the journey. I think companies are probably a little better about handling those things, just being sort of upfront these days.
I mean, it's not even a unanimous thing. Like, for example, AMD, Zen 5, dumb company thing.
Yeah.
But then the 3D Vcache Zen 5, not a dumb company.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
So it's
localized brainworms a little bit on those sorts of things, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I can't really explain the initial Zen 5 release and how everything played out the way it did there. A bit odd. Very unlike AMD, really. I mean, I know they've got a history of botching product releases, but for different reasons. So, anyway.
Yeah, occasionally I think there's been some, maybe not necessarily annoying, but there's been some very frustrating times when I found performance things that just cannot be explained, or at least they are inherently how the product performs or whatever, but just make absolutely no sense. Like, I think back to the times when I've been testing monitors, and I found the first example of a monitor where HDR performance was different on an AMD GPU versus an NVIDIA GPU. When I first found that, I was like, this makes absolutely no sense. Like, why would this be the case? Like, both GPUs send the exact same HDR signal, surely. Like, there's no way it should perform differently. And so I was like, changing over test systems and GPUs, being like, was there something wrong with my test systems? Then change out the GPU in the other system to figure it out. I'm like, I'm still getting the same results. I'm sure this is wrong. Like, this cannot be the case. And just those sort of mind-bending sort of discoveries where you're like, this cannot be what's actually true. It turns out it actually is the case, and there were explainable reasons for that with the monitors relating to AMD FreeSync Premium Pro and those sorts of things. But just those processes that you have to go through where you find those results and you're like, no.
Yeah, wasting loads of time troubleshooting is frustrating.
Yeah, so that happens from time to time.
So like I said, it happens from time to time. So on the rare occasion, I think it is a rare occasion where you're really hitting your head against a brick wall trying to troubleshoot some dumb problem. That's, in that moment, that's the worst part of the job. But yeah, as for what is a sort of a more reoccurring thing, like something that you can be like, if this thing could be solved, the job would be way better. I can't really think of anything like that. It's just,
Yeah, like dumb comments. I think people, maybe, if you listen to our podcast where we talk about dumb comments, maybe a little too much.
You love them. That's why you talk about them, because you love them. They probably annoy me more than Tim. You just find them hilarious.
I do find them funny. I mean, I don't find them that annoying. Like, I think
it annoys me how it doesn't annoy you.
Well, yeah. I mean,
So Tim annoys me more than the dumb comments. Tim's reaction to them. So if we could fix Tim, I'd be all good.
Yeah, I mean, I think dumb comments are at least a little bit annoying, because sometimes you see those things where it's like, how could someone have that opinion or come to that conclusion? But that's just part of doing this job, really. Like, you're always going to get some percentage of people that, no matter how hard we try and explain something, just don't get it. And so leave a comment relating to that. And we've certainly talked about those things many, many times, either privately or in the podcast, but I don't think that would be the most annoying thing.
Nah, not even close.
Yeah. Can/will a 9800X3D perform as well on a B650E motherboard? They've given the ASRock B650E Taichi Lite as an example.
Okay.
Will it perform as well on that board as on an X870E board?
Yes. Do I need to elaborate? I guess if I need to elaborate, if I need to elaborate, what am I talking about again? No, the answer is yes, because probably the easiest place to start with this one is the fact that 600 series and 800 series chipsets are for the most part the same. There's just a shuffling of renaming and whatever.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, B650E is the same as X870.
Mm-hmm.
Exact same chipset. AMD has changed a few things. I think they've made USB 4 mandatory for X870, but apart from that, the two chipsets are functionally identical.
And then the chipsets, for the most part, when it comes to like CPU performance, don't really affect anything at all. It's the SoC is on the CPU, so you've essentially got a chipset that handles things like, how dual channel memory, all that kind of stuff is within the CPU. So the memory controller, like the old days, isn't in the chipset. So there's really not anything that affects CPU performance within the chipset. In fact, you don't even need a chipset to get the most performance out of the 900X3D. If you had a motherboard without a chipset, it would work just fine. You just have less USB ports and things like that. So for certain small form factor applications, you can actually just use these CPUs without a chipset because there's a chipset on the CPU. So doesn't matter. Basically, really any AM5 motherboard, stuff like VRM, allowing for sufficient power delivery, you should get the exact same performance. And again, even like memory support and stuff like that should be about the same. DDR5 6000 really should be achievable on any AM5 motherboard, and therefore performance is going to be the same.
Yeah, AMD did try and claim, at least with the launch of Zen 5, that these new boards would have some specific advantages like DDR5 8000. As an example, they were largely talking about improvements to memory handling, but at least based on what you found, that doesn't really seem to be the case.
Again, technically, there's no technical reason for why that would be, because you've just renamed the chipset.
Yeah.
So it would be weird if they offered superior memory performance. That'd be weird for a few reasons. Again, because like I said, the chipset doesn't actually have anything to do with that for one. So, I mean, that's probably a big one, right?
Yeah, maybe they were trying to claim that like with X870, all the board makers have improved how they're handling memory, but that's not actually related to the chipset.
No,
it's just they're making better boards.
Yeah, so it's not. If that were true, that's a very misleading way of representing the new X870E chipsets, and that's not the case anyway. Because I've tested like 99% of all X870/X870E motherboards, and the majority of them aren't stable at DDR5 8000. So,
whoops,
that's fun. So, but again, that was the same with X670E.
Yep.
So nothing's changed. So anyway, basically, chipset don't matter.
And that does us for part 2 of this Q&A series. Probably all the parts we're going to do for this month.
We're getting lazy.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Second month in a row with just 2 parts.
Yeah,
we're
but
phoning it in big time these days.
Yeah, that's true. We got other things to do, like
play video games.
Yeah,
relax, enjoy the nice weather.
Yep. Yeah, that's true.
Things people do, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
I've heard of this thing called, was it outside?
Yeah, that's the nice weather part.
Yeah. Usually I just enjoy the weather from inside. It's like a visual thing. Like I see that it's sunny, but then I stay inside.
Yeah, you can enjoy nice weather from inside as well.
Yeah.
I mean, you do, but I'm just saying most people, they mean going out. Yeah. Anyway.
Okay. It's a little confusing for me, but I'll get there eventually. Anyway, if you want to support the channel here at Hardware Unboxed, we got Patreon, we got the join button on YouTube. Both great ways to support what we do here. If you sign up, you gain access to like our Discord chat. We got monthly live streams, which we're just about to do, but they happen every month, so that's all good.
There'll be another one.
BTS content. You can ask your Q&A questions in there. We're in there chatting sometimes. Steve will troll you every once in a while, which is nice. So if you want that experience,
it's worth it.
The Discord server
that is worth paying money for.
I agree. So anyway, that'll do us for this one. So yeah, I'm your host, Tim.
I'm also your host, Tim.
Hmm.
All right, I'm
We'll
your host,
see
Steve.
you again
Bye.
next time.